And we begin our session. We're getting close to the end of the class. So this is the session on life cycle events. There's a lot of material I am going to cover here. And there's actually a bunch of references, I think some to my book, but also some to the handbook. So I want to remind you again that on my website, if you go to classes and they have this little button that says click below for handouts, Jewish literacy class, and then you go way down to like number 16 and you'll see this week's class. You will see a PDF of all these slides. So, there's going to be page numbers and references, and you may not pick them up clearly. It will also be in the video, but that's not a terribly convenient way to search through the video to find a particular page number. So I just wanted to remind you that that you have the page numbers and all the slides in the packet. So life cycles. It is a word I learned in rabbinical school, which is a liminal moment or a numinous moment, with the idea being that you're sort of on the cusp of something. So clearly that happens at a wedding, right? When a minute right before the wedding, you're engaged, you're a couple, and then you're husband and wife, and and then families are joined. And so life cycle events are kind of key moments and moments that are open to spiritual engagement. And I find it fascinating as a rabbi that even the least observant of people will start focusing on minutia of Jewish law. So, and this happens quite commonly at funerals. I actually officiated at a funeral today. And you may have a family. Well, this happened when my mother died. You may have a family that does almost nothing in terms of ritual observance, will get hyper focused on what does Jewish law require, require me to do. And this was true when my mother died. My father was not the slightest bit observant, but he wanted to make sure that every detail of Jewish law was followed. And it was his way to honor my mother. Rabbi Harold Schulweis used to describe this phenomenon as people tend to focus on Jewish law when they are hatched, matched, and dispatched, namely ceremonies around birth and baby namings and baptisms and circumcisions and that whole thing. Matched weddings and dispatched a funeral. I remember one couple at whose wedding I officiated, and they were very focused on the fine points of Jewish law. We leave the room where we had the chuppah and the ceremony, and the first table I come to as we're walking to a cocktail hour is a raw bar with shrimp and oysters and everything else. And I'm okay with that, but I just find it very amusing that they're so focused on Jewish law, but clearly keeping kosher was not one of their major concerns. And, it'd be a little poetic, and I can't remember who said this. It's a time when we step back from the canvas to compare and appreciate our lives and the lives of our families. So as I mentioned earlier, before some of you came in, I'm going to make lots of references to the handbook. So there are pages and pages in the handbook which cover a lot of detail on all of these issues. And clearly, because I'm going to go through this rather quickly, I'm not going to give all the details about every life cycle aspect. I have no problem at all if you have a particular question on any particular life cycle issue that you want to discuss further. So birth. It is a mitzvah to have children. Actually, the first commandment in the Torah is pru uvru, be fruitful and multiply. And as you know, the rabbis are obsessed with how do I know if I've done what I'm responsible to do. So in Jewish tradition, the mitzvah is fulfilled if you have two children, and ideally a boy and a girl. But it is also clearly understood if for whatever reason you cannot have children, that this mitzvah is not obligatory if you can't have children. And on another level, it's also there's also a Jewish tradition that a teacher's students are his or her spiritual children. In fact, in my usual rambling sense, there's an issue if someone is kidnapped and now they're asking you for a ransom. Okay, everybody with me on this? And your teacher and your parent have both been kidnapped. And the question is, who do you ransom first? The answer is your teacher, because your parent is responsible for your physical being, but your teacher is responsible for your spiritual and intellectual being. So teachers clearly have a great deal of respect. And the first issue surrounding birth is Brit Milah or bris. The word Brit means covenant, Milah means circumcision. The word bris is just the Ashkenazi way of saying the Hebrew word covenant, just like we have Shabbat and Shabbos, we have Brit and bris. But in common, terminology, when people say bris, they're usually talking about a ritual circumcision. It is in the Torah, Abraham is told to circumcise himself and also to circumcise all of his male children on the 8th day of their birth. And this is taken absolutely literally and seriously. So much so that even if the 8th day falls on Yom Kippur, you still have a circumcision. And that raises all kinds of interesting legal issues if it falls on Yom Kippur, because of traveling, although you have traveling issues on Shabbat. The biggest legal issue is you're supposed to drink wine during the ceremony. And if it's Yom Kippur, you're not supposed to drink wine. So the way they analyze it, or the way they come out with this, is you find a 12-year-old boy who is almost 13. So he's not affected by the strict commandment to fast, but he's close enough so that drinking the wine counts. But of course, the circumcision is delayed if there's any question of the health of the child. Let me just make a note as to who's coming in so I can keep track.
So I'm assuming in the case of a premature child, they would wait till it was older?
Yes, in the case of a premature child, you'd wait till the child is older. And if you've delayed the circumcision, then you would not conduct it on the very first day possible if that day were the Sabbath. Once you've delayed it, there's no longer, you don't have the 8th day imperative. And in times when, if there was a medical condition which would indicate that circumcision was not a good idea, medically speaking, you would not risk the child's life to have a circumcision period. As I'm noting here on the slide, the circumcision is a symbol or a sign of the covenant. It does not make the baby boy Jewish. The baby boy is already Jewish. Traditionally, if born of a Jewish mother, reform of a Jewish parent, and going through these symbols of a Jewish life. The person who conducts the circumcision is called a mohel. In Yiddish pronunciation, moel. You may have heard that pronunciation more than mohel. He is, typically these are all males. In the Reform tradition, they have trained women to be mohelets. So that would be the feminine form of mohel. So typically the moel is a true expert at circumcision, because that's more or less all he does. And I've heard traditions, and I'm pretty sure this is true, that in England, the circumcisions of the royal family baby boys are actually conducted by a mohel. I would say these days, certainly in the Reformed community, what you have are a group of mohalim who are typically docs and often pediatricians, sometimes urologists that are Jewish and that have been trained in the prayers and so on. So docs first, mohels second. And in my experience, it's not unusual for me to be called to do the prayers. So you might have a urologist or a pediatrician who is going to actually do the surgery, and then I will be doing the prayer. So that's not unusual at all. And I am very thankful that no one asks me to do the surgery. And then there's a whole bunch of different roles. The child may be held by someone. The honor of holding the child is a sandik. The child's father says a blessing about bringing the child into the covenant. And technically, the mohel is supposed to ask the father, do you want to do the circumcision, or do you want to basically delegate the responsibility to me? And I've never seen an example of the father saying, hey, this might be fun. I think I can do this. Although I've actually attended circumcisions where the parents of the children was a surgeon. And I actually don't know why they didn't do it, but I guess they were very happy to have a mohel. And let's see. And the prayer includes a prayer for life, for Torah, for marriage and good deeds. Typically, the Hebrew name of the child is given at the time of the circumcision. I mean, traditionally, it's a big secret. If you hang out with Chabad or in the Orthodox world, certainly in the ultra-Orthodox world, the Hasidic world, the child's name is not known at all, and then it's announced at the circumcision. There's another tradition which is interesting, which is called the chair of Elijah. So Elijah is understood in Jewish tradition to be the person who will usher in the Messiah. So there's a messianic aspect to this. And then there's also a story in the Bible about the prophet Elijah, who kind of loses hope and loses faith in whether the Jewish people are going to continue to remain loyal to God. So in one tradition, we basically require Elijah to be at every circumcision so that he, Elijah, can witness yet another Jewish family bringing their child into this ritual. We've discussed this, I think we've discussed this in general, and I've discussed it with several of you individually. Traditionally, male converts to Judaism need to be circumcised. If you are already circumcised, then a drop of blood is drawn from the site of where your foreskin used to be. It's called Hatfat Brit. And like many ritual observances, this is not considered mandatory in the Reform tradition. For those of you that are interested in the Sandra Kaplan Beit Din, since that Beit Din includes the conservative movement, it is absolutely mandatory with the Sandra Kaplan Beit Din. And then, as it won't surprise you to learn that the Reform movement, which is committed to treating as much as possible boys and girls, baby boys and baby girls equally, have developed it's sometimes called Brit Bat, the covenant, covenant for a daughter. And it contains, I would say, all of the liturgical elements, the same prayers as the circumcision, and obviously without the cutting. So it has just some images, and this doesn't look like a baby's penis, at least not to me. I think I may have mentioned to some of you that I actually attended the circumcision of an adult. We had I would say, a guy in his mid-30s who was not circumcised, and he was being circumcised by a urologist that I know in Ventura. And I can't remember if he asked me or I offered to be a witness, because you need witnesses. And so I attended this circumcision, and boy, it is nothing like a baby's circumcision. By the way, my understanding, and again, I'm not a doc, is that at 8 days, there's not a lot of blood supply to the foreskin site, and also the nerve endings haven't fully formed at the foreskin site. On the other hand, the clotting factor has matured, so it's a particularly good time to have a circumcision. I can tell you that an adult circumcision, that the blood supply was very healthy there, and it was something I will never forget. I'm not actually, I think it was more painful for me and this guy's wife than for him, because he wasn't unconscious, but he was thoroughly anesthetized and lying on his back. And that's a medical issue. If he was unconscious, it would require a whole different set of operating room paraphernalia. So it was a local anesthetic. And yeah, this one, first bris. The first bris where I was called upon to say the prayers, because my Rabbi Greenbaum at Adat Elohim had basically threw out his back. And so he asked me to cover for him. And I thought, won't this be wonderful? I'll be doing lots of teaching about circumcision, and people will really be interested. And let me tell you, most people are like this guy here. Nobody was interested in all of my brilliant insights and observation. People just wanted to get it over. Suzanne asked the question, and feel free to ask the question out loud. They absolutely use a local anesthetic for babies in every circumcision that I've been a witness to. Whether it's done in a traditional setting, I just plain don't know. But absolutely, the very first thing that the doctor does, even before he puts on a clamp, is he injects local anesthetic. And by and large, the baby, again, in my unskilled observation, doesn't seem to reacting so much to the cut as to being strapped down and naked and, not being able to move and so on. Okay, so let me move on. So I mentioned naming, and I don't know if we've talked about naming, but those of you that are contemplating conversion should be thinking about naming. So a traditional name in Hebrew is X, son of Y. So my Hebrew name is Moshe ben Chanan. My father's name is Chanan. My Hebrew name is Moshe. I'm named after my grandfather. The Reform movement, again, including women, my Hebrew name, as I sign my name on lots of certificates, is Moshe ben Chanan v'Kroisha. Kroisha is actually a Yiddish name. That was my mother's name. And if it was a girl, a name might be Batya. Bat means daughter. Batya Bat Moshe v'Sarah, a daughter of Moses and Sarah. There is a tradition that you may be familiar with of naming a child after a dead relative and not after a living relative. And that's an Ashkenazi tradition only. And the reason is the assumption that the angel of death is an idiot and might be coming to take Grandpa Yitzhak, because his time has come, and might confuse Grandpa Yitzhak with little toddler Yitzhak, because he's looking at the piece of paper and it says here, I'm looking for Yitzhak. Yitzhak, oh, there's Yitzhak. So what, he's 2 or 3 years old. So that's my understanding of the superstition. And that is not a superstition in the Sephardic world. In fact, exactly the opposite. In the Sephardic world, if you don't name a child after, say, a grandfather or a grandparent, that's a great insult. As I mentioned, a naming of a boy typically takes place at the Brit Milah. And then it's also very common these days in my world that the Brit Milah will not necessarily take place on the 8th day, but they may wait until mom's feeling better and until they can gather everyone, at a convenient time. And so quite often, typically a Brit Milah is a home-based ceremony anyway. And sometimes they will have done the circumcision in the hospital when the child's a day or two old. And then a week later, a month later, 6 months later, 3 years later, 4 years later, I might get a call to say, gee, we really would like to have a naming for our child. So again, I would do the similar prayers, everything but the cutting, for the child. There's a tradition which is really not used much in Reform Judaism called Pidyan Haben. Pidyan means redemption. Haben is the son. This is the redemption of the son. I think in Leviticus, it says basically that the firstborn, particularly the males, are obligated to go into temple service and be priests or assistants or workers or whatever at the temple. Even though the temple hasn't been around for 2,000 years, we haven't gotten rid of this tradition. So this tradition actually is what you need to do to escape from that servitude. So basically, there is a ceremony which takes place on the 31st day of life, and you find a Kohen, and there's just somebody in the synagogue who traces this is basically done in Orthodox and conservative, traces his line back to Aaron, and you redeem the child, and you typically give some silver dollars or something to the Kohen, a gift to charity, and there's a nice ceremony. And the interesting thing about this is it's sort of its technicality. It's only done if the child that opens the womb of the mother is a male. So if the woman has a daughter first and then a son, there is no Pidyan Haben. If the woman has had a spontaneous a miscarriage or a spontaneous abortion or a actual abortion, the idea is that her womb has been open to the passage of a child, even though the child is very, very young, a fetus, then a Pidyan Haben is not done. If the child is the child of a Kohen or a Levite, the Pidyan Haben is not done. And I'm trying to think, we had a Pidyan Haben for my son simply because my parents wanted to have a party in New York in addition to the circumcision which took place in Connecticut. And I don't think I've been called upon for a Pidyan Haben in my career as a rabbi, which makes sense because in the Reform world, men and women are treated equally. And in the Reform world, there is no specifically different treatment for Kohanim, for people who trace their lineage back to Aaron. Any questions while I take a drink of water? Yeah, Caitlin.
I just was wondering, what do you do in the case of like someone like me where my kids are at like bar and bat mitzvah age, and they want to have a Jewish name? Do you wait for the bat mitzvah, or do you have a separate ceremony? Like, how do you address that?
Yeah, so if I had, Jewish kids who have reached bar mitzvah age and we're going to have a bar mitzvah, I would ask them, what's your Hebrew name? And they would say, I don't know, we never got a Hebrew name. And then we could just cook up a Hebrew name right then and there. Or I've actually conducted naming ceremonies during the bar mitzvah. And it just becomes a little thing that we do early in the bar mitzvah ceremony. And I'll, there's a certificate and there's prayers, and I'm happy to include them at no extra cost. And no delivery charge, actually, if you're a member of Amazon Prime. Bar and bat mitzvah. Speaking of bar and bat mitzvahs, the literal word bar is son in Aramaic, not in Hebrew. The word for son in Hebrew, as you may know, is ben, and bat is both Aramaic and Hebrew, and mitzvah means commandment. So bar and bat mitzvah literally means son or daughter of commandment. So then, and I always talk about this at every bar and bat mitzvah, which I officiate, the question is, what in the world does that mean to be son or daughter of commandment? And I like to think of it as mitzvah man or mitzvah woman. And the idea is, as you can imagine, a newborn baby is not obligated to obey commandments, but an adult is. Therefore, there must be an age at which you become obligated. You can think of it as an age when you can vote, an age when you can drive, an age when you can drink. Not surprising in Judaism to have a specific age. And that's 13 for boys, 12 for girls. And again, for reform, since we treat men and women as equally as possible, we use 13 for both. And as you know, I am called upon not infrequently. I will get a phone call out of the blue from someone saying, you know, I'm Jewish, family's Jewish. We've never belonged to a temple. We've never, you know, sent our kids to Hebrew school, but our kids are approaching age 12 and 13, and we want to have a bar mitzvah. Can you handle this, Rabbi? And the answer is I can, but I won't. Because really what they want to have is a party, and they want to do, you know, something to get the kid through a service. Now, with a bright kid, in a few months, they can memorize the prayers. But I always point out, never to their satisfaction, but I always point it out anyway, that in theory, when a child is bar bat mitzvah, this is the beginning of their official Jewish life. If it's just all about the ceremony, it becomes the end of their Jewish life. And a huge issue in synagogues is losing children after bar and bat mitzvah, and often losing the family. That once the youngest child has become bar bat mitzvah, the family kind of drops out of Jewish life. So that's a continuing challenge. And I often say, you know, sometimes actually in connection with funerals, people will say to me, well, you know, I was never bar mitzvah or I was never bat mitzvah. And I often say, I have good news for you. You are bar mitzvah or you are bat mitzvah, because that's a status. Basically, if you're Jewish and have reached the age of 13, you are bar mitzvah, you are bat mitzvah. So why do we have this big ceremony and hullabaloo? What we're doing is we're actually having the child do something that only an adult Jew can do. So broadly speaking, lead a service, very specifically reading Torah on behalf of the congregation. And it's not even reading Torah, it's actually saying the blessings before and after Torah. Only someone who is an adult and Jewish is permitted to do that on behalf of the congregation. So we celebrate the child's coming of age by having them engage in the ceremony. But, you know, I will often say to someone who tells me they've never been bar mitzvah, I say, Mazel Tov, I have good news for you. You are bar mitzvah. So the ceremony, the idea dates back to the 14th century for men and 1922 for women. I spoke briefly in the past, I'm pretty sure, about the Reconstructionist movement. Mordechai Kaplan was the originator of that movement. He was a conservative scholar, and he starts a new movement, and he had 5 daughters. So he actually his daughters become the first women to have kind of official bat mitzvah ceremonies. And in fact, the Judith Kaplan, the first bat mitzvah, died in 1996. And it's not unusual at all that people join synagogues in order that their children be bar and bat mitzvah. I would say that's very common, including in my own case, probably both from me and I think, yeah, my wife would have. I'm not sure if my late wife would have wanted us to join the synagogue, except to have our children educated. And more, we're seeing adult B'nai Mitzvah classes. So people that have never gone through any of the training about what it means to be Jewish, you know, classes kind of similar to what we're doing now. Well, in addition to what we're doing now, we'll study some Hebrew and learn the blessings before and after Torah, and maybe even how to read a little bit of Torah. And typically it's a group exercise that they will participate in adult B'nai Mitzvah. B'nai is simply the plural of bar, of son. So it means children of commandment. Any questions about bar bat mitzvah? Okay, so just some images. Pretty typical, a child reading Torah scroll. Here's the party, and here's one on Broadway. So there's no end to the possibilities. My wife went to a ceremony in Paris. I wish I would have gone to it. Apparently, this is, I think, part of Sephardic culture to absolutely go overboard with professional dancers, and it can get pretty crazy. This looks pretty crazy. Confirmation is something for Judaism, was introduced in the 19th century, extending to girls. And now it's being adopted by some conservative and Reconstructionist congregations. And it's typically 15 to 16-year-olds celebrating on the holiday of Shavuot. And it's absolutely borrowed from Christian tradition as a way, I would say, where Reform was trying to consciously imitate Christian traditions. And basically, the child now is a little bit older, has had a chance to do a little more introspection of what it means to be Jewish, isn't so focused on the challenge of leading an entire service, and it's something they do with their friends, and typically called upon to confirm their Jewish identity. So you will, sometimes they'll all wear white robes. This is more, I think that's, I don't know which rabbi that is, but this is more the experience I'm used to. Okay, so now we're growing older and we're moving into marriage. So marriage is interesting in Judaism in that while it is certainly discussed in the Bible, and in fact, 7 times in the Bible, you have a phrase that goes something like, when a man takes a wife in marriage, or to be his wife. I think literally to be his woman. I don't think there's any particular word for wife in the Bible other than just woman. But there's nothing in the Bible that specifies the ceremony that goes with marriage. So all of the traditions I'm about to describe now concerning marriage really relate, are all defined in the Talmud rather than in the Bible itself. So typically there are 2 parts to a ceremony. One is called Kiddushin, which literally means holiness. You know the word Kiddush and Kaddish, and so on. And it's an engagement or a betrothal. So the groom presents a ring to the bride and says the magic words. And the magic words are Hareyat Mekudeshet Li B'Tabat Zo Kedat Mashav Yisrael, which means, behold, you are sanctified to me with this ring, according to the laws of Moses and Israel. And traditionally, a Jewish wedding ring will look something like this. It is simple, often gold, and it doesn't have to be gold. It has to be worth a sheva pruta, which is about half a penny. The pruta was the smallest Roman coin. And basically what's going on here is he's acquiring her. That's what marriage is in Judaism. The groom is acquiring the bride, so he has to give her some consideration for this deal. And so he presents her with a ring. And then I always have fun, unless I'm told, no fooling around with the ceremony. If they want it absolutely straight, I don't do this. But that's only happened once or twice in the roughly 120, 130 weddings I've conducted. So I always tell the bride, okay, now you look at the ring, you look at the groom, you look at the ring, you look at the groom, and now you have to make a spot decision. Is he worth this deal? You're getting the ring, he's getting you. And if she doesn't throw the ring back in his face, then the witnesses, which are very important in the ceremony, can testify that indeed he entered into this transaction. So that's actually why it is not typical in Jewish tradition to have 2 rings, because if the groom gives the bride $20 and the bride gives the groom $20, there's no net transaction. But I would say 98% of the weddings that I conduct, there are 2 rings. And In Talmudic times and ancient times, the betrothal lasted about a year. And the couple were legally bound to each other. In fact, they would have to get a divorce, even if they never went through the marriage stage number 2. They were legally bound to each other, and they would have to divorce if they decided not to get married. This gave the bride the confidence in setting up a home and not worrying that what's his name is going to run off with some other woman because he's legally tied to her. But under Jewish law, if laws of adultery would apply since they are legally bound to each other. So in traditional Jewish laws, because they're not yet married, they shouldn't be intimate with one another, and they can't be intimate with somebody else. So again, as I say in just about every wedding I conduct, this led to a certain amount of tension. So over the years, the time between Kiddushin and the second stage of the ceremony, which is called Nisuin, got shorter and shorter, and today it's about 5 minutes. So what's actually going on at a Jewish wedding are 2 separate ceremonies, 2 different glasses of wine. One is Kiddushin or betrothal, and the second ceremony is Nisuin, which literally means elevation, which is marriage. And Nisuin is typically accomplished, or is traditionally accomplished, with the recitation of 7 blessings. They're called the Sheva Brachot, followed by a brief period of isolation. And here again, I often point out with a smile that if this were a traditional Jewish couple, they would have never been alone with each other without a chaperone. So in Jewish law, there are 3 ways that you create a married couple. One is with a ceremony, the ones we're talking about here. Way number 2 is with a document, and there's a ketubah, which is a written document that, I'll talk about that in a moment, that and certainly in ancient forms is really a legal document of mutual promises and acquisition. And 3 is by living together. And again, as I always point out, this doesn't mean sneaking off to Motel 6, but this means living together in front of the community. And one of my Jewish law professors mentioned that if 2 Jews, man and woman, talking about in the traditional world, live together openly in front of the community and never had any ceremony of any kind, and then wanted to split up, at least according to some Jewish scholars, I don't know if this is common in the Orthodox community, they might have to get a divorce, a Jewish divorce, to be allowed to remarry. The major symbols in a Jewish wedding is a chuppah, a canopy, which is symbolic of the home, and we talk about how it's open on the sides, so that the idea of your home being welcoming to visitors. And the chuppah, I don't think I have a picture of the chuppah that I travel around with, but I have a very large talus, a talit, so that's common. The ring is symbolic of continuity, and there's lots of different comments on the circular nature of the ring, circular nature of life, but really it's something of acknowledged value. And it's simple, like this one, I know I'm wearing 2, the gold one, so that the bride knows exactly, or can make a pretty good estimate of the value. If in strict Jewish law, if the groom gave a bride which was a lot of stones or a lot of work in it, she wouldn't necessarily be sure of the value, therefore she might not be knowledgeably entering into this transaction. They share actually 2 cups of wine, one for the engagement and one for the wedding, symbolic of shared destiny. The ketubah traditionally is written in Aramaic, not Hebrew, and it's not lovey-dovey at all. It is a prenuptial agreement which defines how much money each party is bringing in, what the bride price is, which, by the way, is 200 zuzim for a virgin new bride, and 100 zuzim for a pre-owned bride, and also what other goods the parties are bringing to the marriage. And then there's also a pre-nuptial divorce settlement written into the ketubah, and it also spells out the obligations that the parties have. So there is nothing lovey-dovey or romantic about it. I would say in the 120, 130 ketubahs that I've officiated, maybe 2 or 3 are traditional, and they are never translated, because everybody would be horrified if you saw what it really says. So I would say most ketubahs are what I would describe as lovey-dovey ketubahs. And it talks about the parties being committed to each other, and we're going to love each other, and we're going to respect each other, and so on. So again, the idea of the groom acquiring the bride sounds horrific and slightly Neanderthal. But what was the great step forward in Judaism is there were very specific rights guaranteed by the groom to the woman. And that was something that was not commonly done in other cultures. And of course, what everybody knows is the custom of breaking the glass, which my understanding of it is it's probably pre-Judaic. It probably comes from pagan ideas that at happy times like a wedding, evil spirits hang out, and so we make a loud noise to frighten them away. The rabbis made this Jewish by saying the principle here is that even at our happiest moments, a wedding, we break a glass to kind of sober things down, to remind us that there's brokenness in the world. But of course, the way this works now at the end of a wedding, it's the happiest moment of the wedding. We shout Mazel Tov, he kisses the bride, and we all live happily ever after. So here is a chuppah with a groom about to break the glass. I am absolutely open to having groom and bride or same gender weddings. It's quite common that both grooms or both brides will break glasses. And it has more to do with the shoes than anything else. I used to give long talks about what kind of glass to bring to the wedding, and it has to be fragile. And people would bring goblets that I remember one where this guy was in his 80s, and I don't think I could have broken the goblet. So ever since then, I bring the glass, unless they buy a handy dandy kit. And in Judaica stores, you can buy, appropriate glasses and then send it in, and they may make a mezuzah out of the broken pieces, or in this case, they actually reconstruct the glass in a lucite cube. And so here's some traditional rings, glasses of wine, signing the ketubah, and here's the ketubah. Yeah, Murray, go ahead.
I said at my wedding, I stepped on a light bulb.
Yes. So again, you're just supposed to break something. And I used this,
Well, I mean, it was because it makes a loud pop.
Yep. And I would give the speech, if you're bringing a light bulb, don't bring a compact fluorescent. But sure enough, I've had couples bring a compact fluorescent, which not only is not that easy to break, but it's, yeah, I just happen to have one here. So don't bring a compact fluorescent. You're not going to break it. And I think there's mercury inside. And then
I don't think they had those 20 years ago.
No. And then more recently, these are LED light bulbs. So we just changed all the light bulbs in our house to LEDs. And what I discovered is this is plastic. I never knew it, but one of our bulbs didn't work, so I took it apart. And so you don't want to break one of those. And I had one wedding where the couple brought a light bulb, glass light bulb, no problem, except one thing which I found hysterically funny, but I couldn't share with anyone. And that was, it was a 3-way light bulb, which I thought was singularly inappropriate for a wedding ceremony. And finally, the only people I could share it with who got a good laugh out of it was the guys in the band. So those are my weddings. I do have more wedding stories, but okay. More rules about weddings. Weddings are typically not performed on Shabbat. I'm actually very flexible about this because the two reasons you don't perform a wedding on Shabbat, I find one silly and the other one offensive. The one that's silly, I don't think I have it here, is you're not supposed to share joys. You're not supposed to share the joy of Shabbat with the joy of a wedding. I think that's silly. The more joy, the better. And then the other reason for not having a wedding on Shabbat is technically a wedding is a business transaction. The groom is acquiring the bride, and you don't conduct business on Shabbat. So that one I find offensive. Clearly, if people are Sabbath observant, you're not going to sign your name to a ketubah. I don't know if breaking a glass deliberately is probably an act of work. Certainly signing your name is an act of work, and engaging in an acquisition is an act of work. So there are many rabbis, certainly all the Orthodox and conservative rabbis, who cannot conduct a wedding on Shabbat until after Havdalah. So I remember as a young, as a kid, a young person in New York, going to some Saturday night weddings where the service didn't take place, until 10:30 in the evening during the summer. And then there are other times during the calendar year, which are periods of mourning, like Tisha B'Av, and again, I don't worry about these, but in traditional Judaism, there are certain periods when you would not conduct a wedding, and also not on holidays. On holidays, you would not conduct a wedding. Interfaith marriage, marriage between a Jew and a non-Jew, is absolutely forbidden in conservative and Orthodox movements. And I would say it's a matter of personal conscience in the Reform movement. The official position of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, the Reform Rabbis Organization, is opposed to interfaith marriage, but they leave it to each individual rabbi as to whether or not they will participate. And I would say 20, 30, 40 years ago, maybe a third of Reform rabbis would officiate at interfaith marriages, and I think the percentages have reversed now. I would say maybe a third, or probably less than a third, of Reform rabbis will not officiate at interfaith marriages. Most Reform rabbis will, and I will after talking with the bride and groom. Many rabbis will require specific commitments about studying Judaism, about establishing a Jewish home. And a very small number of rabbis will also participate with non-Jewish clergy to have a sort of a combined wedding, or have a Jewish wedding with the participation of Christian clergy, or have a Christian wedding with the participation of a rabbi. Murray.
I was married in a Unitarian church.
Uh-huh.
I guess that's neutral ground or something.
Yeah, so is your bride Jewish?
No, that's interfaith.
I was interfaith.
That's why it's Unitarian.
So the marriage.
I'm Jewish, so we had to reach an agreement.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear what you said.
I said that she's Catholic and I'm Jewish, so we didn't satisfy either one of us.
You don't satisfy,
It
or
was at a Unitarian Universalist
oh,
church.
okay, yeah, you met on neutral ground. Yeah, so I would say your wedding would not be considered a Jewish wedding, but it certainly, obviously, is recognized, by the state. And my own legal theory in an interfaith wedding, let's say we have a Jewish woman and a non-Jewish, a Jewish party and a non-Jewish party. My legal theory is the non-Jewish party is agreeing to be married under Jewish law. Just like if you were to drive in Nevada, you're agreeing to obey Nevada, driving code, traffic code. The couple is agreeing to be married under Jewish law. But many rabbis, and certainly in the Orthodox and conservative world, would say a wedding between a Jew and a non-Jew, by definition, cannot be a Jewish wedding. Beth.
We were married under New York state law.
Right. Me too. Beth or Dave, whoever had the question.
I in high school, I understood that there's Orthodox Jews, conservative Reform Jews, and Unitarian.
I don't understand what you said.
Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, and Unitarian are the four types of Jews.
Oh,
There
yeah.
used to be a joke that, if Unitarian was not Christian, so if you were a Jew and you wanted to be a Christian, you became a Unitarian.
Yeah. In fact, there are many people I know, many Jews I know, or people who are born Jewish who are members of Unitarian churches. And I have spoken several times at Unitarian churches.
It's not a joke. It's real.
Yeah. Well, no, I would not say they're Jews. I would not say it's a Jewish movement.
It's not. It's a joke.
I got it. An interfaith couple may have problems in conservative and Orthodox settings once the couple is married, particularly if the man is Jewish and the woman is not Jewish. Their children will not be considered Jewish. And, in some places they won't be allowed to join a Hebrew school, and certainly not bar mitzvah. And typically those issues are not present in Reform. We consider the child of a Jew and a non-Jew to be Jewish if the child is raised Jewishly. On the subject of divorce, divorce actually is mentioned, I think, in the Torah. And it talks about the husband granting a divorce to the wife. And the Hebrew word for a divorce is a get. And there's some information in the handbook about that. And again, this can become a huge problem in the Orthodox and conservative world. In the Reform world, we don't require a ritual divorce in order for someone to remarry, as long as they've gotten a civil divorce and are permitted civilly to marry. Murray.
I was also divorced according to New York state law.
Yes, well, you wouldn't and couldn't be divorced according to Jewish law.
As part of the divorce packet, there was an additional sheet for New York State due to a high Jewish population. That was basically a kind of a get, which basically I signed, basically promising not to crash her next wedding.
Oh. Yeah, so there's no such thing. There's no such thing as kind of a get.
The get nowadays.
Yeah, a get is a very.
No, I mean, it was the legal substitute as far as they can go legally. It was kind of a gimme, to try to satisfy. Yes, okay. I mean, I'm not going to crash her wedding anyway.
Yeah,
but it had some kind of appeal to Judaism.
Yeah, so a get is a very specific document, again in Aramaic. The couple needs to go to a Beit Din, to a Jewish court, in order to have the get. And in some cases, this becomes a matter of larceny. I don't know if larceny is the right word. Blackmail. Larceny, probably. Extortion, where imagine you're in a conservative setting, couple in New York, in the US, couple gets a civil divorce, and the husband will not grant the wife a get. What that means is that she cannot remarry. I mean, technically, she can't even have intimate relations with anyone, because that would be adultery. So he can extort concessions about, child support, spousal support, you name it. So the conservative movement, which didn't, in the Orthodox world, the conservative movement changed the text of the get by adding something called the Lieberman Clause. And the Lieberman Clause says, it's actually in the text of the Ketubah. I may not have said that correctly. In the text of the Ketubah, the husband agrees that should they get a civil divorce, that the husband will promise to grant a get to the wife. In the Orthodox world, since they don't feel free to change the text of the Ketubah, about 2/3 of Orthodox rabbis, my understanding is, will not officiate at a wedding unless the couple signs a side agreement, which is the equivalent of the Lieberman clause. Murray.
I remember there's some issue in Israel, maybe, of like where the divorce is not thorough. I guess in that sense.
This
and
is exactly what I'm
like
describing.
the children of the woman are like precluded from the rest of society because
No, okay.
like,
So actually, we're talking about
illegitimate.
Okay, hold on, Murray. I'll explain it. We're talking about two related things. So one is the husband has to grant the wife a divorce. So if the husband refuses, then the wife either can't remarry, or if she does remarry, her subsequent children will be mamzers. Mamzer is a legal status, which is the child of a forbidden relationship, such as a child of adultery. And the thing you're referring to, Murray, is a mamzer.
Yeah, I remember the word.
Yes. Mamzer, typically a Yiddish word, means, loosely translated, means bastard, but in English tradition, in English law, the word...
I wasn't going to say that.
You'll say...
trying not to say the word.
Yeah, okay. There's nothing wrong with the English word bastard.
Okay.
In English law, the child of an unwed couple is considered a bastard and illegitimate in some sense. I'm not sure what legal standing that has. That is not true in Judaism. If a child is born and the child is not born out of a forbidden relationship, what are forbidden relationships? Typically adultery and incest. The child is perfectly kosher. If the child is born as a result of a forbidden relationship, such as adultery or incest, the child is a mamzer and cannot marry another Jew, can only marry other mamzers or non-Jews. And this is a huge problem in the Orthodox world, because now with computers, it becomes much easier to track who is a mamzer and who is not a mamzer. And there's some interesting sort of legal fiction ways of getting around this. I'll just touch upon one briefly. When the Ethiopian Jews were discovered, this was in the mid-1800s, you had this whole branch of Judaism in Ethiopia that people became aware of. And the problem is that because Ethiopian Judaism did not grow up Talmudically, it was separated from the rest of Judaism before the time of the Talmud, there were clearly no recognized Beit Dins or gets in Ethiopian history. So therefore, since there were no official kosher Jewish divorces for the last 2,500 years in Ethiopian Jewry, every Ethiopian Jew was a suspect mamzer. Therefore, in the Orthodox world, which is the only form of Judaism recognized in Israel, no black Jew could marry a white Jew, which is a terrible thing. So what they did was they ritually converted all of the Jews. They basically said, we're not so sure you're really Jewish. How do we know who your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother was? Therefore, you might not be Jewish. Therefore, we're going to take you, put you in the mikvah. If a male, draw a drop of blood, we're going to convert you, and now you're perfectly kosher and can marry any Jew that you want. I don't know if you had another question, Murray.
No.
Okay, I'm going to lower your hand. So I think so. The Reform movement, as I mentioned, accepts civil divorce as religiously binding. And moving on to Jewish mourning practices. Again, the hatch match. This is the dispatched part. I conducted a funeral today. So in Jewish law, from the time, first of all, the only people who are obligated, I can't remember if I have this list, the only people who are bound to mourn according to the rules of Jewish law are certain relatives of the deceased. These are the children of the deceased, the siblings of the deceased, the spouse of the deceased, and the parents, God forbid, of the deceased. So these are the people who are governed by Jewish law concerning mourning practices. From the time that someone dies until the funeral, there's a period where the mourner is called an onen, and the focus is to prepare for the funeral. So almost all of the positive commandments relating to Judaism, the mourners are exempt from. Specifically, even 3 times a day daily prayer, which is a big deal in the Orthodox world for men. And the focus is on preparing for the funeral. This typically is a short period of time because in Jewish tradition, the funeral should take place no longer than 24 hours after the person's passing, unless that time is delayed by a holiday like Shabbat or another major holiday, or the time is delayed. There's a provision it can be delayed to further honor the deceased. And by that, the typical thing is if it takes a few days for relatives to arrive. Again, this is a kind of ask your rabbi thing. They will say it's okay to delay a funeral. The body is given a ritual cleansing and caring. And again, this theme that the body is regarded as a creation of God and a dwelling place of the soul. So there's a lot of respect given to the body. Specifically, you are not allowed to do autopsies unless they're required by law. You're not supposed to do embalming, which removes fluids and removes organs. You're supposed to be buried with all of your parts. And that arises both from the point of view of honoring the dead, and also there is this sense in the day of the coming of the Messiah, you are to be resurrected. So your body is supposed to decompose naturally so God can resurrect the body naturally. A big question that arises is cremation. And in Jewish law and tradition, it is forbidden. The original reason for forbidding cremation was a question of whether it really constituted burial. Cremation itself, as a common form of disposing of bodies, in sort of Western culture, is only about 150 years old. And so it was prohibited by Jewish tradition and Catholic tradition, primarily from the point of view of not constituting burial and also not naturally decomposing. And then in the aftermath of the Holocaust, cremation took on a particularly, I would say, offensive sense. Suzanne.
I have 2 questions. One is, what about organ donation?
Mhm.
And the second question is, can you explain, I've heard about like a casket that doesn't have nails in it,
Yes.
or that that's just like dovetail joined and stuff.
Okay.
Is
So
that an Orthodox thing?
Yes, it's a traditional thing. So, so let me start with the second one first. Yeah, you're not supposed to use any metal in the casket. Metal is symbolic of weapons of war, and you're not supposed to have metal. Organ donation would be against Jewish law, but remember that to save lives and preserve health, you can, indeed must, violate Jewish law. So if by having an organ donated, you're saving a life, organ donation, I think, other than I would say most Jewish movements, including most Orthodox movements, would permit organ donation. The technical issue in organ donation is what constitutes death. So the question then arises, if a person's life is being artificially sustained through a respirator, for example, in order to preserve, a liver or a heart or lungs or whatever, shutting off the respirator might be technically considered murder. And this is not an issue at all, I would say, in the conservative movement or in the Reform movement. It can be an issue in the Orthodox movement. There once was I remember reading about whether you could donate corneas in Orthodoxy. because someone getting a cornea is getting better vision, but it's not saving their life. So there were, I think, a few Orthodox movements which would allow for other forms of organ donation, but not cornea donation. And
Could
absolutely
save
in
their
the
life so they don't walk into the traffic.
yeah, and preserves health, and you're allowed to do a lot to preserve health. So I would say, for the most part, in most, I would say, modern Orthodox, conservative, and Reform, and other movements, organ donation is certainly praised and considered a good idea. Let's see. The other thing, and I don't remember if I have specific language on this. And again, in ancient times, rich folks got very fancy schmancy funerals, and therefore poor folks were shamed by comparison. So the rabbis decreed that all funerals should be very simple and basically a plain, kind of unadorned, unstained pine box. And you're buried in a simple garment, a shroud, because clothing was quite valuable. And the irony now is people will buy the shroud when they have plenty of clothes lying around. So it becomes perfectly perverse. They're going to be asked to spend a few $100s for a kosher shroud, even though they have perfectly good clothing. But you will see quite a few Jewish weddings, a very, very simple casket. And I would say not always. Even the nicer caskets will still be all wood. And then occasionally people either don't know or don't care. You may see metal caskets.
That's exactly, Rabbi, that's exactly how I felt at my wedding. The casket was terrible.
I won't go there. We're not mixing weddings with funerals.
You did.
Although I have to say, sometimes I will have a wedding and a funeral on the same day.
No,
and I've got to be really careful.
You actually are the one that mentioned wedding and a casket, and that's, I was just following you.
Okay. Oh, you mean I misspoke? Okay, I do that all the time. Thank you. But I didn't realize it, so thank you. So again, I mentioned quick burial, and that's why flowers have never became traditional in Jewish wedding, the Jewish funerals. Thank you. Jewish weddings, lots of flowers, no problem. Funerals, no problem if you want to have flowers, but the traditional reason for flowers at a funeral was to mask the smell of decomposition. If you are having a wake and grandma's in the living room for several days, before refrigeration, grandma would start to get, there would be an odor of decomposition, so they would surround the casket with flowers. Since in Judaism it's traditional to bury quickly, flowers never became traditional, but they're not a problem. I get this question a lot. So let's see, I'm not sure who's first, but I think maybe Grace.
Amy, okay, there I am.
Oh, hello.
Hi there. I
Hello.
wanted to ask about, I heard that in Israel, there are cemeteries where people are buried in a cloth and not a casket. So I
Yes.
just wanted to ask about that.
Yes. So the casket is really in this country more of a function of local laws. So when my mother-in-law, when Sonia's mom was buried in Morocco, it was actually kind of shocking. She was put in a casket, in an area where we had the services. And then we carried the casket to the burial site. And then she was taken out of the casket and put in the ground. And she was in a shroud, and the shroud is opaque, so we couldn't see her. But it was very clear that it was a person that was being hauled out of the casket and into the ground. So in Israel, it's quite common to have burial without a casket. And again, another part of Jewish law is you're supposed to be in contact with the ground so you can naturally decompose. And then there's Jewish legal issues about whether concrete is considered to be earth, because it's made of the same, ingredients. And in other places, in most US states, there has to be some kind of liner, I guess, to prevent, I don't know what, to prevent bodily fluids from mixing with the earth. I'm not sure why they care about that, but
It's cave-ins.
well, yeah,
prevents-
cave-ins are an issue. Yes, yes, absolutely. So quite commonly you will see a concrete liner. In Judaism, it will always be concrete with holes in the bottom. So there's some contact between the earth and the casket. In Jewish funerals that don't care about those rules, and non-Jewish funerals, you will often see a plastic liner, which for me horrifyingly looks like a big Tupperware container. And it's not my favorite thing, but you'll see it. And I guess also metal containers. The mosses.
So a little over a year ago,
Oh, no.
we had a colleague that her husband passed away. She's Indian, from India. And so there were 3 Jews that were in attendance with this funeral. And so we were trying to be very respectful, and we were required to go up and scatter flowers on the body.
Mhm.
And then after that, there was a processional out of the area, and we followed it into what we were to learn would be the crematorium so that we could watch the crematorium.
Mhm.
Wonderful for that family.
Horrifying, right?
For us.
It was one of the most horrific. The 3 of us, we just all looked at each other and went, "What is happening? How did this wind up happening?"
Yeah. So I am willing to officiate at funerals where there has been a cremation, and just once in my life I was asked to be a witness. And now, in my experience, I don't know what. Was this in the U.S. where you saw this happen?
Yes, this
So-
was legal.
So I saw the body who I think was put, I don't know if it was in a shroud or what, but it was in a cardboard box,
Mhm.
and they slide it into a crematoria,
Yeah.
and you see flames
Yes.
that were kind of on like pilot light, but they still look pretty big to me.
Mhm.
And then they close it, and then the real cremation occurs. And in many cases, I have come to learn that there will be a button in the viewing room, so the family, in certain religious traditions, it's appropriate for the family to actually initiate the cremation. But I
Yeah.
agree. I mean, theologically, I don't have a problem with cremation, but
Well, I have no problem with cremation. I think it was more just hearing the
yeah,
as they
yeah.
actually,
yes.
and we were just, I don't think any of us knew what was happening next, because it
Yes,
wasn't like it came with
And, you know,
hint.
and as I point out, cremation just accelerates what's going on naturally. What's
Yeah.
going on naturally is oxidation,
Mhm.
and you wind up with calcium carbonate, you wind up with bone. And cremation is basically the same thing, but it takes a couple of hours. It's not a
No, we didn't stay. We
Yes.
just, once we recognized that indeed this processional was ending with him actually in it,
Mhm.
that's when the Jews ran.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Murray.
Stood back for a little bit. So.
Yep.
Do Jewish mobsters sleep with the fishes?
I have no idea. I think they sleep with the gefilte fishes, but
I mean, what if a family has a rowboat?
well, I've officiated at funerals where people have buried ashes at sea. So
No,
the
not
only
ashes.
I
mean,
understand.
Osama bin
I understand.
Laden type of.
Yeah, yeah. So
burial.
that's not kosher for Islam or Judaism, and I would say, you know, there are lots of things that are not kosher that people do.
Wait, I thought that was kosher for Islam, so that
I don't think it
raise
is.
a stink.
No, I don't think. Well, I could be wrong. I don't want to guess. Suzanne is shaking her head, and she is more knowledgeable on things like this than I. And I think one of the reasons is that they did that is the U.S. did not want to make a martyr out of him and didn't want to have a.
Oh, I know that, but they also didn't want any blowback from the Muslim community.
Yeah, so I don't know. Grace, did you have another question or no? Okay. Okay, so I'm going to lower your hand, and Murray can lower his. Okay, so let's see, quick burial. Visitors don't visit before the funeral, traditionally. The body is not left alone. There is something called a shomer, and there is a guy that just sits and reads Psalms outside the refrigeration unit. And in ancient times, the purpose of the shomer was to protect the body against body snatchers, rodents, and other animals that could attack the body. So there was a real reason for a shomer in ancient times. There is no good modern reason for a shomer, but you still will find them not uncommon. And let's see. So the funeral, simple shrouds only. I will tell a story which I find quite interesting in a little bit. Mention a simple wooden coffin, no metal. Metal being a material of war, inconsistent with the idea of resting in peace. Viewing is discouraged under Jewish law and certainly under California law. Somebody has to make a visual ID to make sure that we're burying the right person. But the concept of open caskets is inconsistent with Jewish law. And when I was a kid in New York, we would have visitations before the funeral, and there was an open casket, and I don't understand it. I have no clue as to why they would do that. Quite often, earth from Israel is placed in the grave. This is the kind of the idea that we tunnel our way back to the Temple Mount for a final judgment. And the best location to be buried is the Mount of Olives, because it's a short tunnel. There's a tradition of tearing the garments. And you're supposed to actually tear your garment. And now, because people don't want to tear their garments, we have little black ribbons. And a child will wear it on the left side, child of deceased, over their heart on the left side. All the other mourners would wear it over the right side, with the idea that a child only has, one father and one mother. You can have lots of siblings and so on. And it's also traditional for Jews to bury the deceased. So the way, it's not uncommon to, at the end of the funeral, there is a tradition of putting earth in the grave. And in some cases, if it's going to be more traditional, the family will want their friends, their Jewish friends, to put enough earth in the grave to actually cover the casket or the liner. And then sometimes they will even want to completely fill in the grave. And it's not a small job. It may take 20 minutes or a half an hour. The Kaddish is an Aramaic prayer. I can't remember if I have the text of the Kaddish here. I'll talk a little bit about that, I think, when I do. And there's also one of the restrictions, which is not an issue in Reform, is Kohanim, since they have to have a higher level of ritual purity than regular Jews, just in case someone rebuilds the temple quickly. They typically don't come into contact with death, and so they will not enter a cemetery. So traditionally, people from priestly families, Kohanim, are buried at the edges of a cemetery so they can be visited by their relatives without actually walking into the cemetery. Yeah, so this is the Mourner's Kaddish, and it's something that many Jews know. It begins Yit Gadal v'Yit Gadash Shemei Rabbah. As I say at every funeral, although it may look like Hebrew and it may sound like Hebrew, it's actually not Hebrew at all. It's Aramaic, except for the very last line. The very last line of Say Shalom is Hebrew. And if you glance at I know it's pretty small, the translation doesn't speak of death or dying at all. So the question is why. It's basically a poem of praises of God. So the question arises, why are we praising God at these difficult times? And one answer, might say it's sort of fortifying your spiritual backbone. You might not feel like praising God at all. So our tradition makes it a mitzvah, namely a commandment that you have to. Another mystical tradition is that the journey of the deceased from this world to the next world and into higher and higher levels in the next world is assisted by people praising God in his or her name. And the last one, which I really like, speaks to what I consider to be the essential teaching of Judaism, or an essential teaching of Judaism, which is the idea that God could have made a perfect world. God could have made a world with no death, with no disease, with no warfare, with no hatred, with no anger, with no hostility, with no bad hair days, an absolutely perfect world. If we lived in a perfect world, what would our role be? What would our job be? We would literally have nothing to do. We would be like flowers, trees, grasses. We might be nice decorations in God's garden, but without any moral significance. And so the idea in Judaism is that God sends us into the world as messengers to do God's work in the world. And I often point out that the Hebrew word for messenger and the Hebrew word for angel are the same word, malach. And so when grandpa dies, as wonderful as the next life might be, it was only in this world that grandpa could do God's work in making the world a happier, more loving, more helpful place. So it's not only we, his friends and family, that need comforting and consolation, but God too needs comforting and consolation, having lost such an amazing agent in this world. And so we do that in the Aramaic words of the Mourner's Kaddish. Bryce.
Yeah, I think we're missing a bet here, and that is the idea. I don't understand the either or idea of God could have made a perfect world, but then there would be nothing for us to complete, and there would be no job for us to do. It's kind of like, you could give people the job of, say, assembling a whole bunch of IKEA furniture in the living room, and that's great. It gives them something to do, but you don't have to put a monster in there that starts killing them and eating them at the same time. So what I'm suggesting is that God could have made the world not perfect, but he didn't have to fill it with such misery.
I agree with you, and we will have that discussion with God at some point, hopefully in the very distant future. So I don't disagree with you at all. So here are some images relating to funerals. There is a Jewish custom I'm often asked about of people putting stones on small stones on the grave, and it's basically just symbolic to show that someone has visited the grave. We'll see this abbreviation in a moment, but this is a Shiva candle. It's a candle that burns for, I think I'm going to talk about the different periods of mourning. The most intense period of mourning is 7 days. The Hebrew word for 7 is Shiva. So you have a candle that burns 7 days. Annually, on one's anniversary of passing, you will light a smaller 24-hour candle, which is called the Yahrzeit candle. This is a gravestone of a priest, of a Kohen, and you see if you can see it, the priestly hands. Here's a funeral procession. This is what someone was asking about in Israel. This is what it would look like in Israel of sliding a body into a grave. This is the kind of funeral, kind of casket, sorry, that I was describing. Here is someone tearing their garments, and there's the ribbon. That's more common, I would say, in my world. Yeah, so after the funeral, there's a period called Shiva, 7 days of mourning. And you ritually wash your hands to cleanse yourself from the ritual impurity of the cemetery when you enter your house. So it's quite common. You'll see a pitcher of water there, and you're actually supposed to say a blessing, which is the mitzvah blessing, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al netilat yadayim, which literally speaks about raising your hands in holiness. Why 7 days? There's a couple of hints in the Bible. Joseph is mourned for his father Jacob for 7 days. And there's another, I think, reference in the book of Job sitting on the floor and his friends just wordlessly comforting him for 7 days. It is interrupted by a holiday. So if you have a funeral, and 2 or 3 days later you have Passover, you stop the rigorous laws relating to Shiva. The Zohar speaks about 7 days the soul going to and from between the house and the grave, mourning for the body. So they talk about a period of confusion of the soul. It's traditional to sit either on the floor or on low stools. That comes from the book of Job. You cover mirrors because you're supposed to be sort of not worried about the way you look. And there's also superstitious traditions that the soul of the departed may be in the mirror. Traditionally, you don't get shaved. You don't. A man would not shave himself. I guess a woman wouldn't shave either, parts that woman shaves, or get a haircut. You don't leave the home except on Shabbat. So this gives rise to something called a Shiva minyan. What a Shiva minyan is, since a traditional Jew must pray 3 times a day, and the traditional Jew, if he's one of those mourners that I mentioned that are governed by Jewish law, cannot leave his home because it would only apply to men. Therefore, the minyan has to come to him. So in a traditional setting, every day except for Shabbat, you don't mourn on Shabbat. So every weekday, you would have a morning minyan and then an afternoon and evening minyan. And typically the afternoon and evening minyans are combined. You're actually not supposed to greet mourners. So when you enter the house, you're supposed to visit during the Shiva period, and you go over and you just sit with the person and you take your lead from the person. So you don't say, hi, how are you? How are you doing? You just sit. And the person may want to talk about the deceased. The person may want to talk about politics. They may want to talk about sports. Basically, you are there for the other person. Your purpose there may just be to cry with them and not literally not say a word. The rule is, this is, I guess it's Jewish law, and it's also a good rule. Always go, always call, no exceptions. You may be uncomfortable. You may think the person doesn't want to talk. If they don't want to talk, they will let their call go to voicemail. So, and I would say, generally speaking, if someone is sick or ill, unless you've been told that they don't want to talk or don't want to call, always call. On Shiva, always go. I also suggest sitting and observing Shiva for 7 days. I think in our culture, there is this, stiff upper lip, get on with it. And I would say if you've lost someone very close to you, you should take a week out to recover and to mourn and not try and rush getting back into life. So here's some images of Shiva. There's mirrors being covered, lots of food. Typically, dairy is served, and eggs being symbolic of life, round things focusing on the cycle of life. And this is a particular type of pitcher, which is called the Netilah, that's used in connection with ritually washing your hands. Murray.
I seem to remember when my grandmother died, my father went to synagogue like for 11 months.
Yes. So yeah, we'll get into that. Yes, thank you for raising that. On gravestones, you will often see these letters, Tet Nun Sadi Bet Hey, which are symbolic of Tehei Nafsho or Nafsha, Tzura B'Tzura Chachayim, may his or her soul be bound up in the bond of everlasting life. Again, coming from biblical sources. And quite often you will see someone's Hebrew name. You'll often see the letters Pei Nun, which stands for Po Netaman, here lies. And you will often see the person's Hebrew names. This is my father's gravestone, and it's Chanan bar Yaakov, Chanan the son of Yaakov. And here is a woman's grave, Gertrude Rosenzweig Den, Gittel Esther Bat Meir, and then Niftara died. And then here's the date in Hebrew, the 5th day of the month of Adar, and we'd have to translate what actual date that is. Oh, I want to tell you the story of the Reichman funeral. So I'm gonna, whoops. Yeah, I'll back up one. Well, I didn't need to do that. Oh, wow. Okay. The Reichman funeral, I'm not going to read it. I'll just tell you the story. It has to do with a tradition in Judaism of not being buried with anything and being buried only in a simple shroud and not garments. And I know, at today's funeral, the wife of the deceased arrived early, and he had lost his wedding ring. She bought him another wedding ring. She put on him, and he was buried with that. He was buried with pictures and things like that. This is not traditional. And the reason it's not traditional is it's imitative of Egyptian practice, where they would bury wealthy people with lots of stuff that they would need in the next life, and even their retinue of slaves who wouldn't necessarily be dead at the time of the funeral. So there's this great story about the Reichman family, fabulously rich Canadian family. And old man Reichman dies, and he leaves for his sons 2 notes, one to be opened immediately on his passing, and the second one to be open a month later. We'll talk about the month and the year in response to Murray's question in a moment. The one that was to be open immediately upon his passing is a request from him that he be buried wearing a certain pair of socks. And so his sons go to the mortuary and bring the socks. And the mortuary, of course, being Orthodox, says, no, it's just going to be a shroud. And they actually protest, and they go to a Beit Din and the Jewish court, and the Beit Din says, no, just a shroud. And a month later, they open the second note, and the note is from Papa Reichman to his sons with the following lesson. He said, by now you have discovered that although you can make billions of dollars in your lifetime, you can't take with you as much as a single pair of socks. And this is a true story, and I really like it. So after Shiva, there is a 30-day period which applies to all of the mandated mourners, all the mourners that I mentioned before, to avoid social gathering and entertainment. It's also halted by a major Jewish holiday. And then Murray raised the question of a year-long observation. So you have Shiva, which is 7, Shloshim, which is 30, and Shana, which is a year. So in Jewish tradition, the children of people who have died mourn for a year, observe mourning for a year. And this relates to the idea, which comes out of mysticism, that there is a place called Gehenna where you pay for your sins, and depending the amount of time you need to spend there is a function of how bad you were. So, but nobody except for really bad people spend more than a year. So the tradition actually is, Murray, I don't know if this is part of what you were asking, of 11 months. Would you say 11 months or a year? I can't remember.
The number 11.
Yeah.
In my mind,
So the tradition is to publicly say Kaddish at every service. For traditional Jews, it would be 3 services a day. Less traditional Jews, it would be, Shabbat or whenever you go to synagogue, for 11 months. Why 11 months? Because you don't want to make a statement that mom or dad really is going to need every last minute to pay off of their sins. On the other hand, you can't be too careful. So nobody's embarrassed. We're not asking you to make a judgment how long you think you need to observe this. Everybody publicly mourns, children mourn for their parents for 11 months. The Yortzeit's a Yiddish word, an observance on the annual anniversary of someone's passing. And in Judaism, that's a significant date. We don't focus on birthdays. In fact, my grandmother didn't know her birthday. In Judaism, birthdays have no significance at all. When she came through Ellis Island, they asked for her birthday, and she didn't know what her birthday was, so she had to make one up. And there is a custom of unveiling, which is, it's really a custom. It's not a matter of Jewish law, of dedicating a marker. And it usually takes place around a year after someone's passing to allow the earth to settle. And even in cases where you have a liner, earth still settles. And clearly, if there were no concrete liner, then the casket would collapse and the earth would collapse. So if you put up a stone very quickly, that would be a problem. I think that's it. So I will stop the sharing and ask if there's any questions, comments, thoughts. I know we took a bit of time and there was a lot of material to cover. Yeah, Lois.
At the beginning, when you did that quick summary, I thought you talked about.
I can't quite hear you. You need to speak to wherever your microphone is. That's fine.
Okay. At the beginning, you did this quick summary and you talked about yard side candles.
Mhm.
And I've sort of been waiting to ask you because I thought you mentioned some other styles. Like I know the glass one with the candle in it, but then you had something else that you showed.
Well, there's a big one, which is a Shiva
Not-
candle.
Yeah, not the Shiva one. No, for yard side. Actually, you showed the picture of the yard side candle. You didn't talk about it that
No,
much.
I mean, people will use electric ones if they're
Yeah.
concerned about open flames. And I have an electric one that I use, but I
Well,
can't
maybe
think.
that was it.
Yeah,
Maybe.
maybe that's it.
Okay.
Any other questions? Okay, would you guys like to hear
I can
another?
make a comment.
Yeah, go ahead, Murray.
Two things. The first was it wasn't the Reichman story, but when my father was alive, he always did point out there was a comical play, I think, called "You Can't Take It With You." I never
Yes.
saw it, but I think that pretty much says the point of it. And the second thing was when I did my family tree like 20 years ago, the tradition of having so-and-so, son of so-and-so on the marker made it easier for me to locate or to verify where people were in the family tree. So
Yeah.
I thought that was
Every now and again, I will have
a good thing
somebody.
to have.
Every now and again, I will have somebody send me photographs of graves. I had one family who probably sent me 30 or 40 photographs. They must have visited the family cemetery and just went around where they knew, because all the gravestones had English names on them, so they knew all the relatives. And so they took pictures of every gravestone and asked me to basically help them with the Hebrew names. And of course, as you point out, Murray, in the Hebrew, it would have son of or father of, not father of, son or daughter of the parent. And so that is helpful in family trees. I visited my father's grave. We observed the 100th anniversary of his birth a little over a year ago. And I saw typos. I mean, it's hysterical to me that, because I know, my father's cousins, they were all the child of the same person, and the person's name was misspelled on the gravestone. And I am sure no one has ever noticed this before. Basically, instead of
My great uncle had a photo of an unveiling from 1937, I guess, in black and white. And when I found my great grandparents, I mean, it matched the photo. So
wow, cool.
It was kind of strange to see that. And I did see the two of them. And I mean, the tombstones, they must have been over 7 feet high. And they were all in a cemetery. There's certain sections, and this was in one of the older sections. In other words, normally those will fill up, and then they'll open up newer sections, so you can sort of see the history there. I do remember always putting pebbles on top, though I didn't know why.
Mhm.
Although when you saw pebbles on the gravestone, you knew that somebody had visited.
And that's the reason.
And I guess, well, we would always look for the largest one so that it wouldn't get blown off.
Right. And
And
in
the
many
last thing was on the last thing was on my great grandfather's. He has an etching of a pitcher, and it was my understanding that that's a designation of Levite.
Yes, so there's different symbols. Definitely Kohanim, you see priestly hands, the Levites. I think they may have had a lamp, I can't remember. And women have typical symbols
It
rather
was a
than,
water pitcher.
I'm sorry? A water pitcher. Yeah, that makes sense because the Levites.
It was a water
Yeah,
pitcher.
yes, that makes sense because the Levites would wash the Kohan's hands and feet. And I'll add one more thing, and I'll call in Caitlin, that I know in New York or in New Jersey, where my family cemetery is, it was organized by the people coming from a village in Russia. So the village was named Hummel, and the society is called the Hummler Young Men's Society. And so basically everyone from that area is buried in one section of this
Oh yeah, the
cemetery in
section
Fort
was
Lee.
called the American Ben Minsker section.
Yep.
And they're kind of enclosed in like a little fence.
Yes.
Kind of like it's not. It's
Okay,
a little fence.
let me move on
And,
to Caitlin. Caitlin, go ahead.
I actually have two questions.
Uh-huh.
One is about naming. So as culture has shifted over time, do people now sort of relax their naming practices with names belonging to one gender? Would you give a girl a Hebrew boy's name and it wouldn't be weird? Are there some that are like that, or is it very set and traditional in all of the different communities?
I would say weirdness is in the eye of the beholder.
Well,
so no, very specifically, my daughter Andrea is named after her grandfather Aaron, so her Hebrew name is Aharona. So it is quite common to have a child of one gender named after a relative of another gender, but I would say it is traditional to use a feminine form of the name. Like instead of Aharon would be Aharona. Instead of Yehuda, it would be Yehudit. So that's pretty common. In fact, very common.
my other question has to do with the Yarzeit candles and prayers.
Yarzeit, did you say?
Yarzeit, sorry,
Yeah.
I dropped the T. If you don't know the date that the person passed away, do you just make your best guess, or is there?
Yeah, I don't know what other alternative it would be, but yeah, make an informed guess. Okay, I'll tell one kind of funny story about naming, and I will let you go. One rabbi I know that had a good sense of humor was working with a family about a naming for their child, and the child had sort of a strange name, and the rabbi made a comment. The rabbi was telling a group of rabbis this story, and the rabbi, asked the couple, "Oh, that's an interesting name. What's the source of the name?" And the couple kind of looks at each other and says, "We don't want to tell you." And the rabbi says, "Why?" And he says, "Because you're going to get angry." And the rabbi says, "Of course I won't get angry," thinking to himself, this is going to be good. And so the couple says, "We named him after our dog." And the rabbi is struggling to keep a straight face. And the couple responds defensively, "We loved our dog." And the rabbi says, "Oh, has the dog died?" And the couple said, "Of course, we wouldn't name our baby after a living dog." So on that happy note, I will wish you all a good evening and a happy Hanukkah. And our next session is in January. Jewish community conversion movements, synagogue life, and so on January 6th. So have a wonderful winter break, travel, fun, holidays, and more of the same.
Yeah, we're
One in
getting
the
a lot here.
sun.
Would anybody like me to mail them any snow?